Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to the organizers of this event for having put in so much effort and work. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is what I saw, what happened to me, and how it reflects upon everybody else who's out there. I guess I want to start on the day that I was shot, along with 1,700 other people in the Gaza Strip. That was May 14th, 2018. And on that day, I woke up nice and early. The protests were supposed to start at 2 or 3 after the Friday, or after the afternoon prayer. And we got very early reports of deaths along the border. It was 9 o'clock, I think, when the first report of the first death showed up. So we all stopped what we were doing and started to head toward the border. Me, the other medics, the other doctors. That was this year, 2018. And when I showed up, there was this moment at which it felt like there was something holding me back, like an almost, it felt so much like a literal wall, though I know it wasn't a literal wall. And I remember as I kind of came into the threshold of the protest, the protest area, realizing that here came the moment to decide, am I in or am I out? I don't really frighten easily, and I've seen a lot of shit in my years. But something about this day really gave me a dread. And I hadn't really felt that in years, many years. Actually, probably the last time I really felt it was the day that I saw a massacre in Cairo in Egypt, and then the subsequent events that followed that. So there I was, sort of at the threshold of this protest, not wanting to go, feeling terrible. And I thought, I have to go. And I crossed. And as I walked in, I saw the throngs, the tens of thousands of people, the piles and masses of humanity. And it looks like one organism. It looks like one mass. It's so overwhelming in how big it is, and how loud it is, and how you're touched everywhere, how you hear sound from every angle. And of course, the gunshots. The decision that I made to be there was not a collective decision. It was an individual decision. And one of the things that I realized was that every other person who was there, all of those members of that throng, had also made their own individual decisions. They had all decided to come. They had all probably felt very much the same thing that I did, that sense of dread as they walked in, knowing that the Israelis didn't mind shooting civilians and had no problem doing it in protests past. I felt I was somewhat protected because up until that point, no medic had been shot in 6 weeks of protests. No medic had even been injured by live fire in that period of time. As the day went on, basically we developed into a routine. I met with the medical team. We stood off to the side. Another group of journalists stood off to the side, to another side. Of course, the journalists and the medics are usually not intermingled because the journalists always think those medics, they're gonna get shot, and I don't wanna be near that. And the medics always think those journalists, they're the ones who always get shot. I don't wanna be near that. And both of them know I wanna be nowhere near the protesters because they're definitely gonna get shot. And sort of as I was kind of walking into this, I had my earbuds in. I'd been listening to this radio podcast on BBC called The Infinite Monkey Cage. And if you know what that show is, congratulations, you're the second biggest nerd in the room. Unless you're also 3D printing medical equipment in your basement, then you might be the first. But as we collected these medical teams, we would sit and we would wait. And every few minutes, we would hear a gunshot. We would look around, figure out where the person was who got shot, and then run over to her, to him, and do our quick assessment. So many people were getting shot that I hung back. I was the only doctor in the group. And really, I'd only go in if people were shot in places where they might die immediately. Not the legs, not the arms. We already had that down pat. The tourniquets that we had been printing and making in Gaza, I mean, we, as in the Gazans, were printing and making in Gaza, had been used to great effect. And up until May 14th, not a single person died from losing blood from their arm or their leg, which is great. I mean, that's not the way that it would have been even a few years earlier. And so it was, we would hear the shot. Somebody would fall, we'd run over, and then collect them, treat them on the spot, get them away, and then reset. After a certain point, there were so many gunshots that people started to hit the ground. And then it became incredibly hard to figure out who was shot, because usually one of the ways to know is that somebody was standing and then they were lying down. And that's not usually like for any other reason other than that they were shot. When everybody was lying down, it became much more chaotic, much more problematic. Couldn't figure it out because people would be on the ground, we'd hear the gunshot, we'd know somebody was shot, we'd look around, everybody's yelling, and it's up to us to figure out where to go. The Israelis, by the way, would sometimes come on the loudspeaker to guide us. They tell us sometimes where the shot would be before it was, sometimes after. Sometimes they'd say, that guy in the red shirt, and then boom, down he'd go. And sometimes when they could see that we really couldn't figure out where the person was, they might radio over and say, no, no, to your left. I don't really understand what exactly the thinking was on the other side, but I wasn't really trying to. This is not a moment for philosophy. It's a moment for reaction. There are things happening. You're completely in the moment and focused. Anybody here who's ever been in an emergency room understands that. You focus on the task at hand. You deal with the ethicals and the philosophicals later. And so I was standing, watching the field, turned around talking to people. And I heard a bang. I was like, oh, somebody's been shot. Then I was looking at the sky. I was like, oh, I've been shot. And then I felt an incredible pain in my legs. And I thought, I've been shot in the legs. It was both of them that was hit, but one of them much worse than the other. So I actually didn't know they were both hit. Couldn't figure out why people were tending to my right leg when it was my left leg that hurt so much. The paramedic, first paramedic who attended to me, his name was Musa. And Musa started to do what any of your colleagues would do in medicine in a situation like that. He made fun of me. And they cut my pants, they treated me, and they got me out. That happened 1,700 times. 1,700 times. But it happened one at a time. Because the Israeli response was not to nuke Gaza. No, they didn't see it as a throng either. They saw it as a collection of individuals. And so they shot at those protesters one at a time. It was intimate, very intimate. I've never fired a gun, but I know a lot of friends who have, and I've asked them what it's like. The sniper has to become one with their target. Snipers, when they're interviewed on TV shows or in general when you talk to them, they talk about how they follow the person, how literally they can predict every movement before they make it because they're so in tune. And when they decide that it's time to take the shot, they're looking through that scope. They've been looking for minutes at just one person. And the penultimate thing that they do is hold their breath. Stabilize it. You know, if you breathe, you mess up the shot. Hold their breath. And then shoot. It's intimate. Intimate. Completely one-on-one. In that moment, literally, even the sniper's breath isn't in the picture. Just the sniper and his victim. That's it. It's funny how overwhelming the masses of people are when we say 1,700 people. It's overwhelming. But it's also crushingly devastating to think of it on an individual scale sometimes. When we think of the number one, that's loneliness. And here we are caught between the two. If we stop to think about each individual, we might get crushed by our own loneliness, or maybe we think we're that individual. And if we think of these masses, we're overwhelmed. It's hard. And the balance is something that we have to really try to keep. There is ultimately no way to look at that crowd and think that we are them, because we're not. We've all made our own decisions here to be here tonight. And yes, these decisions are important. These decisions are ones of solidarity. We are, by being here, being in solidarity with the people in Gaza, with the people in the West Bank, with the people in the refugee camps, with the people who are oppressed in Israel, with the people who are oppressed everywhere. Because, of course, the struggle of the Palestinian people and the reason why there's so much focus on it is not that there's something special about Palestinians. There's not. It is that, unlike almost every other struggle of deep, pervasive, and historical injustice, this one is winnable. This one is one that we're going to actually win. And our actions are the determinant. They're what change this from us being overwhelmed or crushed into a future in which there is actually justice for the Palestinians. After I was shot, I was taken to a mass casualty area. And because I was a doctor, I was offered the best everything. They offered me pain medication that they couldn't offer to other patients. Can you guess what that pain medication was? Not fentanyl, sadly. I would have taken that. It was Advil. Advil. Yeah. Advil for gunshot wound. Anyway, I couldn't even imagine if I offered that to one of my patients with anything, really. And they said to me, would you like us to get you on the next ambulance? We'll take you to Shifa, the premier hospital. And I knew I didn't deserve to be at Shifa. And of course I said, no, I'm fine. Fine. And so they parked me. And I was waiting for this ambulance that had been modified to accept 6 patients at a time. So they would stack us. It was like a catacomb. And we would just get stacked and then wait. Every once in a while, we'd hear another gunshot. And then, true to form, 3 to 4 minutes later, one of 2 things would happen. Either an ambulance would take off, that means that person was shot critically, or our catacomb would have another number. And I mean, it's not like you needed to ask what happened to you. You know, everybody was shot and everybody was more or less shot in the legs. 60% of all the gunshots were in the legs. And 60% of them, the ones in the legs, it's called kneecapping. So you shoot through both legs and then you create a tremendous amount of disability. Of course, it's incumbent on us to say that we don't know exactly what the Israeli soldiers are thinking. But the numbers are troubling, really troubling. There have so far been 12,000 people shot since March 30th. 12,000 people. And 60% of them, that's 8,000, I think, if my math is about right, were shot in the legs. 20% of them were shot in the arms. Anybody who deals with gunshots knows that those numbers should almost all be in the chest. You don't shoot people in the legs if you think that they're a real threat to you. Shoot them in the chest. The chest is the biggest area to shoot at. It's called center mass in like police talk. So you aim to shoot at the chest because that's the big area to hit. The secondary effect of that is that you kill most people you shoot in, not most, but many people you shoot in the chest, especially if they don't get care very quickly. With the legs, you don't often kill them, especially once we implemented our tourniquet campaign. Instead, you disable them. It's an old Civil War tactic. You don't shoot them in the arms because then they can walk themselves off the field. You shoot them in the legs, that takes 4 or 5 people out. Yeah. So none of this is new. I remember lying there, waiting, and thinking, I should be out there. That feeling of incredible and ultimate hopelessness, not being able to do anything. Yeah. Especially with training like mine. That's a terrible feeling. And finally, when our van was filled, we were rushed off to the hospital. A peripheral hospital that had no business taking in gunshots, the equivalent of basically an urgent care around here. And when I showed up, the doctor who received me was a young doctor who I had trained when he was a resident, which you might think is a good thing if you think I'm a good teacher, but they were just so busy that, you know, it was one of those moments of, it's okay, I'll take care of myself. And I literally sewed my legs up, had an x-ray, looked at it, realized that nothing was broken, which meant, you know, nothing urgent to be done. And off I went. Had that been in Canada, I would have had a surgery to clean the leg, because of course, the big risk was infection, and that's actually what came to pass for me. Right now, MSF, Doctors Without Borders, released a report about a day or two ago, saying that there are 1,000 people still who are in various stages of infection and disability who might lose their legs. There have been 100 people with amputations so far. I think 85 leg and about 10 or 15 arm. So we're talking about very serious, very pervasive disability. The hospital I showed up at had no power. They had a generator, but they had no diesel. And on that day, all the diesel was going to go into just a handful of places. Definitely it wasn't going to be the emergency room. When finally they sort of turned it on so that they could get a few of the x-rays done and things like that, that was sort of a look for me into what it was that these hospitals could and couldn't do on the basis of electricity, and how different it could and should be if our work here succeeds. The lack of power and how I experienced it as a doctor is one of the reasons that I've been working on solar power in hospitals for a while. And that's how I met Robert for the very first time. I was working on solar panels when CFOS and other groups in Canada were working on fundraising. We succeeded in putting solar power on several hospitals. I think it was 3 or 4 in the end. I forget the exact number. And the idea for electrifying Ahli came as a result of some of the discussions that we had around that. That was hopelessness that didn't crush us, but that inspired us. It was tragedy that we looked at and thought, there's a solution. There's a solution. And so look how close we are. Look how close we are. Yes, I want your money. I think you should donate generously. I do. This is a project that will keep on giving. Al-Ahli is the most important Christian hospital in Gaza. It is a significant, heavyweight hospital in its own right. It doesn't just treat Christians, it treats everybody. And the people at Ahli consider themselves to be first and foremost humanitarians and health warriors of God, I think was the description once said. If we help Ahli get electrified, then we stop people from developing diabetes or worse diabetes later. We'll help people have their surgeries in a timely fashion. We'll help them get their x-rays when they're supposed to. We'll stop bad things from becoming worse, and we'll stop chronic things from happening in the first place. Early treatment is what helps. Early treatment is what saves lives. I said I want your money, but I don't think that that's enough, because ultimately all of us who are here, none of us came here because of the promise of electric solar panels on a hospital. We came here because we believe that there's something more important that we need to do. We came here because we believe that the thing that we have to do is transition this Gaza from the shithole that it is right now into some place that we would be proud to tell our children that we contributed to. And that happens on multiple levels. Whatever level it is that you know to work at, it probably helps. We already said money is one. Also, talking to your local politicians is another one. Fundraising in general or raising awareness in your groups is yet another one. Volunteering for CFOS, another really important one. So I have a request for each and every one of you. Pick one thing that you're going to be able to do. One of these three. Either donate 500 or more, commit to finding 500 or more from a group of friends or through a fundraiser or bake sale, or get 5 friends to help volunteer for projects like CFOS, either on the political side or on the humanitarian fundraising side. I want to wind down and hear from you and take your questions. But I want to also recognize one of the people who was deeply involved in my story. You know, one of those 1,700 who was also one of the 60 people who was killed that day, Musa Abu Hassanin. Musa, I told you, was a paramedic who came to me and helped treat me when I was down. He was not supposed to be there that day. He was very highly decorated, highly qualified. He was an excellent paramedic and a trainer. And so he had the seniority to not show up to the field. And so when I saw him, I asked him, Musa, why are you here? Because he had been through 3 wars. He had 4 kids. I knew that he had that threshold moment too. I knew that he looked and knew that nobody would say anything if he turned back, and still chose to go forward. And when I asked him, Musa, why are you here? He said, what am I supposed to tell my kids if I'm at home? What kind of a father would I be? What kind of a human being? What kind of a colleague? What kind of a leader to these paramedics would I be? And so Musa was shot in the chest. While I was in hospital, I was there for about an hour. One of the paramedics from the civil defense, the unit that sort of was at the most front part of the protests, kept turning his radio down when he was around me, and I couldn't understand why. And later I asked, and what they told me was that Musa, after he was shot, nobody could get to him because there was shooting all around. Anybody who tried to rescue him would be shot as well, and several people were wounded trying to get to him. And he'd keep radioing in, saying, I can't breathe. I can't breathe. It's getting worse. I can't breathe. The irony, of course, being that this man who had rescued me had a condition so simple that I could literally have treated it with the inside of a pen had I been there. It was a tension pneumothorax. And finally, by the time they got to him, he was all but dead. He died a few minutes after he was rescued. I spoke to his wife a few times. And most recently, I called to ask her how things were going. She told me, it's dark out here. She meant it literally, of course. It was literally dark in their home. But she meant it figuratively too. She said, it's lonely out here. And that, of course, to anybody who's ever been into one of these refugee camps is an incredible statement because they swim with people. What she was talking about was the same thing that we all recognize and intuitively feel. That the many and the few are both the danger, that we have to live somewhere in between, where we can see the individuals around us and at the same time not feel alone among them. I don't know what I was supposed to say to her. And so I just said, I'm sorry. She asked me during one of our conversations why I lived and Musa died. Yeah. Those conversations happened hundreds of times in the last 6 months. Hundreds. So, remember what I want you to do. Feel the despair. I do. But fuck the despair. Because if it crushes us, it's no good. If it drives us, though, fine. I'll take it. All right, I'll leave it on that super depressing note. Take your questions if you want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tarek, for that really powerful and chilling speech. And thank you for all the work that you're doing and for being here tonight with us and for sharing your story. We're going to start taking questions. While we do that, we're also going to pass around a basket for donations. As we take questions, I'd like to just remind everyone, of course, no racism and no misogyny or any kind of bigotry will be tolerated. And yeah, so what we'll do is I think Steve will let us know as the questions come in from the live stream as well. But if people could just start putting their hands up if you have a question, and I can walk around with the mic.
I heard Jonathan Kutab, the lawyer, whom I'm sure you know and most of us do, he said that for the first 2 weeks of the protests in Gaza, the medics and journalists weren't shot. And after that, they were, so he figured it was a change of deliberate policy. Is that your experience? Also, I dare say this has occurred to you as it just occurred to me, that a hospital with solar panels on the roof, donated by Canada, are they going to bomb it?
Okay, so 2 parts to that question. One of them is, was there a policy change? So to my knowledge, I was the first medic who was shot at all in 6 weeks. So it was not 2 weeks, but 6 weeks. Before May 14th, there were no medics who had been shot and wounded. There was some sort of shrapnel hits and things like that, which is kind of part of the job that doesn't indicate anybody really aiming for you. And we were so close to the snipers that we could see them, like we could almost see the whites of their eyes. So from here to this back wall ×2, that was kind of the distance. So we were pretty close to them. If they wanted to shoot a medic before week number 6, they probably would have shot that medic. Musa was the first of 3 medics to die. The second was Razan, and the third, I forget his name, a gentleman from southern Gaza as well. In one day, 19 medics were shot. It's very, very clearly marked. I was actually the least clearly marked of all of the medics because I didn't wear the high visibility vest. I wore only the medical greens. And the reason I decided to do that is because you kind of have this macabre choice. Do I wear the high visibility vest? Lots of paramedics who are killed with the high visibility vest have the bullet right through the center of the cross. And so some of them don't want to wear the high visibility because they think it makes them an easier target. And I'm one of those people. Obviously I was wrong, oops. I'll wear high visibility next time. But 18 other people were shot in high visibility after that, so. What was the policy? We don't know that yet. We'll figure that out another 10 or 15 years. But having said that, it's very, very troubling. It's very troubling and very concerning that this many medics were shot and there's no accountability at all for it. Part two of your question, if we put solar panels, will they be bombed? Maybe, but if they bomb the solar panels, they bomb the hospital, and then you have bigger problems. Like nobody's wondering what's gonna happen to the chairs in the emergency. If the emergency gets bombed, like, yeah, you got bigger problems to deal with at that point. Solar panels, in terms of return on investment, are so wonderful. You spend $250,000, for example, like Al Ahli is gonna be electrified on $450,000. Like, I mean, a remodeling of one part of my emergency costs more than that. So the amount of money is very small, and if the hospital gets bombed, that's a $20 or $30 million repair. It would be no problem to add another $500,000 to that.
We'll take another question. And just a reminder to everyone asking questions, if you can, to please stand up so the live streamers can see. So I'll make my way down here.
Have you had any signs in yourself of PTSD, and what would you do about it?
Oh boy, leave it to the psychiatrist to ask that question, eh?
So I'll just repeat the question. The question was if there have been any signs, or do you have any signs of PTSD? And is that correct, or what was the rest of it?
That was it. That was it. Okay, so everybody is different, and I think that's very important to sort of lead off with. And the way that I deal with things is different from how other people deal with things. It works for me. That doesn't mean it's healthy. That doesn't mean it's good. How do I deal with it? I take my trauma and I curl it up into a tight little ball and I bury it really deep inside. I don't know what you want me to say. That's what I do. I think I'm doing fine. I don't have trouble sleeping. I don't have flashbacks. I'm mostly not hypervigilant. Like the only times that are bad for me are sort of May 2-4 and Canada Day when the fireworks are going off. Fireworks are not good. But other than that, I think I'm fine. I don't know. Ask the people around me. They can probably tell you how fucked up I really am. But.
Okay.
My question is, since they seem to be targeting medics, would it be useful to have Doctors Without Borders there as sort of human shields to help you?
Okay, so that's a very interesting question. Doctors Without Borders is not in the business of direct protection. So their main resource is physicians, and using physicians as human shields is probably not a great idea.
I can't hear.
The comment is because they might be reluctant to shoot at physicians as opposed to lay people. Yeah, but there aren't enough physicians in the world. The only physicians that are in that much quantity outside their home country are Cubans, and the Israelis would probably shoot Cubans, no problem. Like, the political cost on Cubans is low with their main audience, which is the Americans. So I don't think, realistically, I don't think there's a population of physicians anywhere in the world that would be capable of accomplishing that task. Having said that, I think we're asking the wrong question. very often people will look at a situation in which, in medicine, we always say when you see bodies in the river, you don't say, well, how can I collect these bodies faster? Or maybe I should set up a net. You say, well, why don't we go look up the river, see what's happening up there? And I think that the effort that would be required to mobilize hundreds or thousands of physicians to be human shields would better be spent on stopping the shooting in the first place, which is attainable. We can do that.
There's a question online. Somebody is asking, what is happening with the Trudeau government's investigation into your shooting?
Okay, so there is no Canadian government investigation into the shooting. I never asked for one. I don't want one. I don't care about one. There is, in theory, an Israeli investigation into the shooting. I can't talk much about it just so that I respect the process. However, I can say that of my 3 interrogators, 2 of them were in Israeli army uniform, and the name of the group was the Israeli Army Independent Fact-Finding Mission. I even said to them, you can't just put the word independent and suddenly it becomes independent. So I do not really care which individual soldier shot me and what he was thinking. I don't. This was a 21-year-old who was under orders. Gaza's a bad assignment. Only the poor kids go there. If this guy gets nailed to the wall, it's not going to accomplish anything. What I do care about is that man received an order from somebody higher than him, who received an order for somebody higher than him. And those are the people who are culpable. And that's not going to change with an independent investigation. We've seen these investigations way too many times. They expend tremendous amounts of political capital and they accomplish nothing. What I want is to take away the root causes. The root cause here is desperation and bad health. That is my main focus. How do you accomplish that? Yes, obviously ending the occupation. But there are intermediary steps. There are things that we have to do. For example, if somebody's having a heart attack, I can't say to them, well, you should stop smoking. Well, yeah, but I need to deal with the heart attack right now. And that's where projects like the tourniquet, the stethoscopes, 3D printing, solar electrification all help. These things, by the way, these projects are designed so that they help today in the current state, but they also help later. Like if you have solar power on hospitals, that doesn't diminish you when you're a free state. That doesn't diminish you when the occupation ends. That's a good thing that we need in London, Ontario, as much as we need in Gaza City.
Hello. I wasn't sure it was on. Tarek, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's so powerful. But I think also for us here, witnessing just the photographs that have come from the Great March of Return, they are like absolutely epoch-making. It's like Dante's Inferno. They are of such enormity and such meaning and substance that it boggles the mind that it's actually a Holocaust. The magnitude of it, that it can be allowed to continue with so little regard. I mean, that's really soul-destroying. And I know we don't want to be crushed by anything, but somehow I think there's also an attempt to crush our souls and our resistance and our ability to resist. So I'm very thankful to you for sharing your story, and even amidst the crushingness of being there, that you can still look at it in such a courageous way and also encourage us to stand up in this enormity. So it's not a shithole, it's a hellhole, but we also have to deal with it. Thank you.
If I could just respond to that a little bit. The word Holocaust is very, very loaded, and I would reject it in this context. If we were to take a word like genocide, that might be more appropriate and a little bit less loaded. What's happening to the Rohingya is genocide. Happened in Kosovo was genocide. These are places in which there were active, massive genocides. There might have been periods in Palestinian history where arguably there is a genocide, but I don't think that the Great March is one of them. The Great March, that doesn't diminish, by the way, what's happening out there. It's fucking horrific. It's a terrible, terrible scene. And it is worse in real life, which is an incredible thing to say, because when I'd watched the videos before I went, the march began in between two of my trips. And when I watched the video and photos, I thought, oh my God, this is awful. And then when I saw it in person, it was more awful. It was more terrible. This is one of those cases where really the severity is not conveyed. I don't think we need to go beyond what's actually happening and describing it. I mean, it's bad. It's bad. The comment, though, about how this shouldn't crush us, one of the funniest things that I found was that the march felt, from the Palestinian perspective, there was a lot of tragedy for sure, especially around the shootings. But I felt that the Palestinians treated it like a theater of cultural resistance. Probably that's the best expression. They were out there basically demanding their rights. When they would march on these soldiers while getting shot with their hands up, that's not because they're stupid lemmings. That's because they were making a demand. Their demand was don't shoot. The Israelis, they rejected that demand. But at least, that's the nature of that particular protest. The people, I could always tell exactly who was going to get shot. You could guess it, you could predict it. And the way to know a person was about to get shot was that they were dancing. They were happy. They were out there yelling, screaming, and singing. You knew that one was going to get shot. And anybody who was wounded, that one was going to get killed. They didn't wound twice. So people would come out, with their legs cast on crutches. There was a huge shortage of crutches, of course. You're talking about thousands of people shot in the legs. And anybody, we always knew the wounded people were going to get killed. There was no second wounding. Now, why is that? It's because you already know that this guy or this woman, there were some women who came in exactly the same way. That person has a heart, has life, has courage, has daring. So you just shoot to kill. Yeah, the shootings aren't about putting down a protest. They're about putting down a movement. And that movement is for rights. Hard to kill that.
Thank you for the great talk. Can you comment on how the local Israeli news covered the Great March and the shooting of the medics and the journalists? And what are your thoughts about how the Palestinians are able to deliver people's stories into the Israeli society beyond the politics of Fatah and Hamas and the PLO? And more on the logistic side, for my second question, for us living in the US, is there a sister organization so donation could be matched through our employers and so on? Thank you so much.
I don't know the Israeli media well enough to comment, so I really shouldn't comment. The main source that I use to understand or try to understand some of the thinking from the American sort of Jewish perspective and from the Israeli Jewish perspective is Mondo Weiss. So that's probably the best English language source at all. And by the way, they're running their own fundraiser now. So if you support that kind of journalism, then support them. So I read Mondo Weiss pretty closely to try to understand it. I can theorize, but it would be no more accurate than anybody else theorizing. I don't have firsthand knowledge, and I'm not an expert on that. So I'll stick within my medical domain on this one. The second question, American groups, yeah, there are tons of them that are around. Probably the main one would be, there's a shoot, what's it called? I think it's called like Middle East Children's Aid Society or something like that. Anyway, you can look them up, and there are lots of 501c3s that do lots of good Palestine work. Yes, that's it. Middle East Children's Alliance. So yeah, and they're pretty good. They have good projects too. Okay, who's picking the questions here?
I think, Steve, do you have someone on live stream?
I do have a couple of questions here. Let me find the camera that shows me. Here's a different question altogether. People are wondering about your 3D printed stethoscope. Is that something you're actually doing in Gaza? And tell us a little bit about that. I've also got a question about kind of what was the reaction of your colleagues when you were shot? Was there any statement from the medical association? How did your colleagues react when you came home? Some of those kinds of questions too. So there are 4 or 5, but I'll just stop with those 2 and come back to the others, and friends online, we will get to you, I promise.
Okay, I'm gonna take a chance to geek out on medical equipment now. This is the package that we give physicians in Gaza. It's a 3D printed stethoscope. That means that everything here that you see that's orange, I'm just gonna take out the Health Canada tag here. Everything that's in orange has been printed out of plastic. In Gaza, the plastic is actually recycled plastic, which is not as fun as it sounds. It's actually really hard to recycle 100% of plastic and print with it. You have to mix in raw and virgin material every once in a while. But notwithstanding, Gaza has a 100% recycle rate, because what are they supposed to do with their garbage? They also have, if I'm not mistaken, one of, if not the world's largest organic farm, then one of the world's largest organic farms. Because if you were the Israelis, would you give the Palestinians fertilizer? Probably not. So there are some really odd, really interesting opportunities that arise to create like a better society. So this stethoscope is based on a model called the Littman Cardiology 3, which is a $200 to $300 stethoscope, depending on where you are in the world, and is based on technology that's 100 years old. So what we did is we tested and created a version that was as good while being much, much cheaper. The tubing that's in there, the tubing is basically from fountain pop machines, so Coca-Cola machines. The idea was, we had always been told, you'll never go anywhere in the world where you don't see Coca-Cola machines. That appears to be true from our experiences. So we used tubing that's commonly used in fountain machines to be the tube that connects all the pieces together. It started to be distributed there, but we had to put all of these projects on hold for the tourniquet. The tourniquet was popularized by the American Army in initially the Vietnam era, and then went out of favor for a period after that, then again after the Afghanistan war era. And basically it stops bleeding. In 2014, 2,500 people died in Gaza, and about half of them died from exsanguination. That is to say, they bled to death. And about half of them took at least half an hour to die, half an hour to exsanguinate. Those are, like, from our perspective, that's a treatable, that's a preventable death. Nobody should die because they were sitting around bleeding for half an hour. So when we initially started the tourniquets, we knew that there'd eventually be another war, but we actually didn't make them for the protests. We started a year before the protests. When the protests erupted, then we kind of rushed all of our work and energy into producing them, and finally have been able to get our production up to match the number of people wounded each week during the protests. The plan is to put about 100,000 all over Gaza, which is an insane number. That's a lot of tourniquets, but when the Israelis start shooting and bombing, people aren't able to move around, so you can't have large depots in certain places. You have to have little depots everywhere. There's about 1,000 mosques in Gaza, so the plan is to put about 50 in each mosque, and then the balance, put them in schools, in grocery stores, in canteens, basically everywhere that we can. And actually, funny enough, we take a lot of experience from the American mass shooting stuff. So the Americans have a lot of experience in mass shooting, which we're drawing upon to prepare in Gaza.
First of all, my condolences to Mr. Musa Sanani. And as a university student currently who aspires to do this type of innovative healthcare equipment bringing to the states like Afghanistan, my question is to you, how did you get access to going into Gaza? And are you feared of them bearing your access to the state because of your work?
Yeah, so I'm currently banned from going into Gaza or into Israel at all. So definitely access is one of the main weapons that's used against us, anybody. If a state denies you access and you know that you have to do certain things to avoid those bans, then you tend to behave like that state wants you to behave. Doctors have a very, very unique place within society in general and within these conflicts, in that even though there are lots of people who think that, I am a terrorist and things like that, there are also lots of very sane voices in Israel that recognize that what I do is important and that what I do is not something that's bad for Israel, but that's something that's good for Israel. Now, frankly, I don't care if what I'm doing is good for Israel or not. I care about the fact that it's good for the people who I'm supposed to be serving, the victims of the siege or the blockade and the occupation and such. But having said that, there are lots of people within Israeli society and within the Israeli military even who are pulling for people like me. I've met Israeli doctors after I was shot. And, that connection, we're all, at the end of the day, we're all doctors. And if I had an Israeli soldier wounded in front of me, I would treat them. And if they had a Palestinian, fighter wounded in front of them, they would treat them. Medicine doesn't really know those sorts of divisions, nor should it.
Thank you, Tarek, for this great presentation. We know about your work and other doctors' work, like Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitti, and they are a great individual initiatives. Did you ever think of establishing an institution of doctors, forming a group of doctors, specialists, surgeons, so you can discuss with the health authorities in Palestine about the specific needs of the hospitals, whatever they need, so you can coordinate all the work of Palestinian doctors and the people in Gaza?
Okay, so this is a delicate topic. Basically, if we work with, so NGOs have a problem that's very well known, which is that they're a non-democratic institution that is inherently vested in the perpetuation of the problem that they're there to serve. So for example, if you're an NGO and you come and you 100%, let's say you're an HIV NGO, you come, you 100% cure HIV, that's the end of your work. And of course, a lot of people would recognize that as a happy ending. Like, for example, I say all the time as a doctor, oh, if everybody was healthy tomorrow, I'd be happy to be out of a job. But would I really? I know it's not going to happen, but so in medicine, the most dangerous thing is conflict of interest. And NGOs are conflicted. Because firstly, Israel requires them to do certain things to maintain access. So they're largely ineffective in Gaza. Largely, not always and not all of them, but generally. And then the other thing too is that the way that they get funds is very different. People here, let's say, who donate might have very different goals from people there. So they're naturally anti-democratic. Now, the flip side of that is, well, why don't I just go work for the Palestinian government? Well, because then I would go to jail in Canada. So I'm already in Canada, probably, like lawyers have told me, you're in violation of Canadian anti-terrorism law. I have no real legal defense because there's this anti-terrorism bill in Canada that says that not only if you help terrorists, but if you provide comfort to terrorists. So let's say, for example, a terrorist, I'm just gonna keep using the word here, has a child and that child falls and hurts his ankle. And then I see this child in the emergency department. Well, I've now provided comfort to the terrorist, right? So there's no legal defense for me. There's only a public relations defense. Like, it would be really embarrassing to throw me in jail over this. So we have to kind of, I think, be somewhat clever about it. The last bit is if we make an institution to collect all of these people, I think that just becomes a big fat target. All of our institutions generally end up being targeted, so we've had to really have a type of leaderless, like we're all in, let me choose my words carefully. There's a big conspiracy of doctors to try to make things better for people in the world, right? But having said that, you know, like we all talk, obviously. I talk to doctors in Syria and doctors in Palestine. I talk to doctors in Latin America. Actually, we have a project starting in Mexico and Chiapas. There's lots of these things because we all have shared struggles. So we all work together, but we have to also be conscientious that when we create institutions, those institutions become very vulnerable.
I'm actually going to take 2 questions on this side. So I have one here. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, I have a political question. I haven't read too much about this, but after the U.S. cut off funds to UNRWA, Canada did, I think they upped the amount that they donated fairly quickly after that, after the funds were withdrawn. So I was wondering who was responsible for that, since Canada has, you know, for conventionally been, you know, so one-sided in support of Israel. So I was wondering if you know anything about how that happened.
Okay, so I'm not engaged in politics, and I'm a doctor, and that's sort of the extent of my world.
Your t-shirt, there's puppets on your t-shirt.
These are all sports figures. There's nothing political about that. The man loves athletics, that's all. Okay, so thank you for that, by the way.
Why are those t-shirts? I can't see why you got.
These guys were at the Olympics, and they did a Black Power salute for rights of Black people in the 60s. And this guy is doing something very similar nowadays. Yeah, he's a football player with nobody at the moment, but he's a football player. Okay, sorry, just try to answer that question, actually. UNRWA is life support for the Palestinians. And the Israelis, actually, when Canada cut off UNRWA funding in 2007, the Israelis asked them not to. So if you might remember, I think it was, I forget the guy's name, who got up and said not one red cent to Hamas. No, it was one of Harper's guys, the guy from the East Coast. I forget his name. Not Peter, I forget his name. Peter McKay, that's it. Anyway, when they said the not one red cent to Hamas, actually behind the scenes, the Israelis were saying, please don't do that. Because at the end of the day, Israel is going to pay for instability in Gaza, which is what's happening right now. I mean, the Great March of Return is completely and directly the effect of the pressure that both the Israelis and the Palestinian Authority have placed on Gaza. And the explosion in Gaza is going to be pointed squarely in the face of the Israelis. They know that. They're not stupid. And everybody knows that. Nobody's that stupid. So putting money in UNRWA helps quiet the situation. I think what we have to do is we have to ask for institutions that are not reactive institutions, but rather institutions that are society building institutions. So the best way to make Palestine peaceful and pacify all of the violence is make it wealthy and make it just. that's it. Okay, sorry, I'll cut it off there in the interest of giving other people a chance.
I have another question over here.
You mentioned earlier that this conflict is solvable, and you said Palestinians will win. On what? Why do you think how will Palestinians win, I think is a better question. And what will the victory look like?
Okay, I don't know what the victory will look like, but I know what the retreat positions are. So right now, when I talk about what I would consider a full Palestinian victory, would be full rights, human rights for Palestinians everywhere. That is to say, inside Palestine, outside Palestine, right? And I use the term Palestine, but really more correctly, it would be Israel-Palestine. Because at this point, I think it's silly to call anything one or the other, right? Really, they're so integrated that probably any future is going to look like an integrated state.
So you don't believe in the two-state solution?
The two-state solution is dead and buried, my friend.
Okay.
No, that's not necessarily a good thing, because everyone's working so hard towards this thing. But in medicine, for example, we have these markers, these things where you say, I wonder if this person is dead. They're probably dead. Maybe they're dead. And then there are things like rigor mortis, where they're dead.
It's very clear.
The two-state solution is in rigor mortis. So, and that's a function of a lot of things that have come together over time. The settlements is a big part of it. The lack of unified Palestinian voice is another big part of it. What would a Palestinian state look like? I mean, you can't even get the Palestinians agreeing. There's no meaningful nationalist movement any longer. Nowadays, we've oriented around a human rights-based movement, and that's the move that you see. So what are the retreat positions? Well, I mean, I think that they'll look the same in Palestine as they've looked in other parts of the world. The first step back was an Oslo-like solution. We'll keep mostly control, but we'll let you administer the small stuff, rearrange the deck chairs, as it were. The next retreat position would be a Palestinian state in very limited territorial sovereignty with some control over its political affairs, but no control over its economic affairs. Right? This would be very similar to the Bantustans in South Africa. So Palestinians can vote, they can elect their leader, and their leader can't meaningfully change anything. Think of Puerto Rico, that's another good example. Then the next retreat position after that would be political and economic in a relatively true two-state solution, but definitely no military. And then after that, as we go back, we get into these one-state solutions with and without economic control. So South Africa, they stopped, the battle stopped for equal rights at the point where they were delivered a one-state solution with political rights and minimal economic rights. Right? So Black people did not take over the economy when they took over the state. They definitely didn't really take over the most important parts of the military. The nuclear arsenal was dismantled, et cetera, et cetera. So those are, I think, the retreat positions. What I'm pushing for, personally, is human rights for every Palestinian. That's the right to health, that's my business. The right to movement, that's not really my business, but I mean, that's something that I want as a person. The right to, self-determination, the right to education, all those things.
With who in control?
Well, I mean, who cares at that point? Who cares who's in control if everybody has their rights?
Because whoever gives them the human rights can take them away.
I mean, I think that's hard to do when you have a state that has moved into that process. You're right, things can go back and forth. We see that, Egypt had a revolution, then it went back. As for why I think we're going to win, well, you look very young, but you look old enough to remember '89. Now, at what point did you know that Berlin Wall was going to go down? 5 years before? 10 years before? I had one teacher, a very smart professor, who told me that he was at the Berlin Wall the day before it went down for a conference, looked at it, said, this thing's never going down, got on a plane, and when he landed in Atlanta, the new CNN was broadcasting images of this wall going down. Everybody in this room remembers the Arab Spring. I talked to the security official from the Canadian government, and I was like, I'm just super curious. What did the Canadian government know? And you know what his response to me was? Our expert on Tunisian fruit vendors was out for the week. That means they had no friggin' clue what was happening. Yeah, it was a fruit vendor who basically committed suicide. So it's not our job to make the change. It's our job to make the conditions for the change. And sometimes we'll get really, really close and it won't happen, but that shouldn't discourage us. No. It should keep us going.
Thanks, Tarek. Thank you for the steadfast work that you've done on the technology side, and you're so humble in terms of your role with the 3D printing and the tourniquets and the stethoscope. So thank you so much for that as well. Yeah, so I'll just maybe mention that here in Canada that we have started with what will be an international campaign called Gaza 2020, which comes from Al-Haq, the regional human rights organization in Ramallah and Palestine, and it is a call for sanctions from countries until the blockade is lifted. We could certainly take that further to the occupation is ended, till right of return is realized for that matter. But in terms of being in solidarity and standing strongly with the Palestinians, with the Great March of Return as they go into week 36, I think already tomorrow, we're really pleased to have rolled that out with 100 organizations here in Canada, having just sent a letter in that regard with very specific requests to the Canadian government. And we do that realizing that probably there's not a lot of hope of a quick turnaround, but at the same time with organizations like Amnesty International and others having signed on, and the fact that we do have not only international law on our side in Canada's need to uphold international law under the first Article 1 of the 4th Geneva Convention, but also we do have domestic law here in Canada on our side, which is something that from a legal perspective, be it Jonathan Kitab, who has joined with me with Just Peace Advocates here in Canada to bring this campaign with Al-Haq here, the lawyers from Al-Haq. I mean, for us to say, yes, Canada does put sanctions on another dozen or so countries beyond what the UN does, we might suggest that some of us that those probably shouldn't be in place, but what is clear is that where there are systemic violations of human rights, that sanctions should be put in place. So it's a reasonable request. And so any thoughts, I know that you're not political, but any thoughts of encouragement as we start to work with people over the next few weeks to be in members of Parliament's offices during the holiday recess and make that clear would be welcome. And a more practical question just around PSTD. Was the idea that, you know, while I was certainly just in Palestine over the last few months, it is the number of drones, the number of warplanes going overhead that you can hear in 48 and in the occupied territory in the West Bank and Al-Quds. What is that like and what is the impact of that? Because, I mean, we don't get that in our daily news. Many of us that do follow Palestine know that there are bombings happening that aren't making the news, but there is just that continual warfare happening that's below the radar of most of us here in the West.
Okay, thank you for your comments. Just in terms of BDS, to be clear, so I'm a law-abiding citizen. It is illegal in Israel to support BDS, and anyone who supports BDS is not allowed to enter. I need the Israeli government to let me in to get into Gaza, so I don't support BDS. It's that simple. Having said that, in terms of the other parts of your question, they're very complex in terms of the effect of the constant war, but obviously it's bad. I mean, it affects everybody, but it affects children the most. And the way we see that is in the rates of bedwetting, which are incredibly high. People as old as 12 and 13 are still bedwetting, which is unbelievable. Any parent here who's had a traumatized child or who's had a child with bedwetting can kind of understand like how devastating that is. And if I have some problems with fireworks, like imagine, you know, how a person who grew up, a 10-year-old right now, would have lived through 3 wars plus the Great March. Now that's pretty devastating. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up at this point.
Yeah, so I think we're going to wrap it up unless, Steve, there's nothing pressing on the live stream, right? You just say when we only had.
The questions on live stream have been similar to the questions in the room.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you so much to everyone for coming here tonight to hear Tarek's story. Thank you to our endorsers and all of our supporters here today. And thank you so much, Tarek, for coming here today and telling us all about your experiences in Gaza. It's been an emotional night, but it's also, I'm personally leaving here with a lot of hope for the future and for a lot of hope for what justice will look like for Palestinians. As you all walk out, there will be, as I mentioned before, a basket with regards to the solar panel project that we are raising money for. And we do have all of your emails, so we will email you once we have an idea, probably at the end of the weekend, to know exactly how much was raised, how many solar panels we've managed to get, and to give you an update too, and give you an opportunity if you'd like to get involved. So thank you so much, everybody, and thank you, Tarek.